I was giving the invocation at or a prayer at the OSU Medical Center's graduation for med students several years ago, when I had been serving on the IRB board, and the Master of Ceremonies had come up and opened the thing, and then invited me, and so he had his things left on the podium, and I brought my prayer, and then when I left, I took accidentally everything, and he gets up, where's my stuff? And so I anyway, had to give it back to him. So sometimes when our mind is very occupied with something, we accidentally pick up things that don't belong to us and carry them off. How many of you carried a hymnal home? No? A few of you? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah, okay, or at least out the door and have to come back and put it back.
I don't have a copy of this new one now that we're using.
Oh, you need one?
Mm-hmm.
We have a few that are broken, and we don't want to put them out, so they're hiding around the church somewhere.
Really?
Yeah. So I'll try to find you one and try to stick it in my bag.
No, there are a few hymns in this new hymnal that aren't in the old.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. And that, yes.
There's several that first hallway.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Well, back in that closet in the hallway where you can hang coats. Have you ever noticed it?
No. There's a closet back
Yeah. Yeah, between that door and the Rose Chapel on the east wall.
Oh.
Yeah, there's a door there. You open it up and it's a closet.
Oh. What do you know?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
Okay, now to pick up where we left off. Last week we were into this chapter 15, which a lot of us are not real familiar with it because it's kind of strange, but some of the Old Testament scholars think this is the most important chapter in the Old Testament. And especially for this, just to refresh our minds, at 15:1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, and we think that may be the Yahwist is starting to get a little anxious and nervous about anthropomorphizing God, just coming down and talking to people face to face, and so he is altering it a little bit in a vision or a dream. But anyway, God says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." But the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir, but no one but your very own issue shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven." And so we think now, at this point, to looking up to heaven and count the stars means it's nighttime, that he has this dream or vision in the setting of the source of this part of the story. And if you're able to count them. And then he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he, Abram, believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. This 6th verse is so key to New Testament writers have gone back and grabbed this and reused this account of the nature of faith. However, some of the scholars think that this is the Elohist version, and when this is happening in that story, And that source, it is back in the Ur of the Chaldeans when God first appears to him and says, leave this place and go where I will show you. And then he has trouble believing that, so he says, go outside and look at the stars. We think that's the setting for the source of this part of it that's been inserted here. And then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land. But now this part of the story, he's already left, but now he's already in the land. And I gave you this land, but he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abram brought all these things and cut them in two, sliced them in half, laid them out, laying each half over and against each other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down to start eating the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. Now we have a part where as the sun was going down, so now it's daytime, boom, at this source of this covenant that's being made of slicing the animals in half, was an ancient tradition. So the sun is going down, and a deep sleep fell on Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. And if we skip to 17, then it says, and when the sun had gone down, and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these two pieces. So this is an image of this ancient covenant making where Abram is asleep and dreaming again, but it is God who is the flaming torch and the pot. They can't see God, but it's like God's carrying them between the two halves of the animals, and this was the way people made covenants. They walked between the parts, and it's essentially saying, if I don't honor my promises, then what has just happened to these animals, let that happen to me. Let me be cut in half or chopped into pieces as punishment for breaking my promises. Anyway, that's kind of the nature of this bizarre thing happening. But anyway, but what was inserted between that part of the story is Abram falls in a sleep, and then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in the land that is not theirs, and they shall be slaves there, referring to Egypt, which is, and putting into the story why he can't possess the land right now, that they have to have this interlude. And they shall be oppressed for 400 years, and the timing is off on that, but anyway, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions, meaning that's a part of the story of the Exodus. They take great possessions with them. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, meaning you'll live a long life, and you'll be buried in a good old age. And this is understood as a great blessing, not to die early or young through accidents or disease, but live a full, long life. And the expression is, you will be buried with your ancestors. But to have that happen, you'd have to take the body back to the Ur of the Chaldeans. So it's just an expression. It doesn't mean that they're going to cart his body back there. And they shall come, and your people shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet finished or complete. Anyway, then that sun went down, and it was dark, and the smoking pot and the torch. But anyway, then on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river. Anyway, the description of those places is the expanse of the kingdom at its largest point under Solomon's reign, is what is believed there. Now, where I didn't get finished, was, and I just said part of this. See, the iniquity of the Amorites is believed to be the sexual immorality, and then we'll get to that when we get to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Okay, Von Rad had an interesting explanation of the origins of this these stories and where some of it came from. And I want to share these with you. He says the narrative about God's making the covenant in verses 7 to 18 is probably one of the oldest narratives in the tradition about the patriarchs. And it's difficult to question about this pre-Mosaic religion of Israel's ancestors. In other words, there was a religion prior to the revelation of what is your name, I am who I am, or I am who I will be. Ayeh Asher, Ayeh, as Muzan has told us so often. That revelation of Yahweh as the God, but they already had some religion, some understanding of a God, and some beliefs and some practices of some kind of worship that they had. And so he calls it the cult of the God of the fathers. And in these pre-Mosaic communities, the names of men with whom the cult began and whom God's promise and guidance had proved exemplary were transmitted with great care. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the first recipients of the revelation and founders of the cult of the God of the fathers. And we hear that expression a lot of times. I am the God of your fathers. And my name is Ayeh Asher Ayeh. So we get that link or that connection at different times. But anyway, there were these founders of the cult, and the stories about them are some of the oldest and the most ancient traditions that had been preserved and then gathered up and written into the Genesis story with a scissors and paste or cut and splice kind of process using different ones. Now, we may take it as certain that the promise of the possession of cultivated land was an essential ingredient of the old religion of the fathers, and one must assume, however, that the promise of land was originally to be thought of as quite direct and at hand, meaning you would take possession immediately. That was what they thought the promise was and expected it to be. And they didn't reckon on departure from the land and then a second immigration into the land. But only afterwards, as the story evolved and history evolved, they came to understand that's what was meant. So in this passage, we get a working of the ancient patriarch story and weaving it into the story at a time later, so that this adjustment from the expectation to the reality was woven into the story, so that it's kind of, if you'd only remembered or thought about it, didn't I tell you that way back when? Oh yeah, now I remember. Well, anyway, it gets worked in that way. But the cult of the God of our fathers as part of the precursor to the Yahwist or the Hebrew faith, the patriarchs and their faith was the beginning, and they wanted us to understand that. And then Brueggemann, his commentary on this chapter, he says it's pivotal for the Abraham tradition, and theologically it's the most important chapter for the themes of faith and covenant that are the big part of the relationship with God and our side of that covenant, our faith, and what it's supposed to be and look like. So questions of faith in the promise when the fulfillment of the promise is delayed. Now, it's real easy to have a strong faith when you pray and you get what you prayed for. You pray, you get what you prayed for. I mean, kind of like little kids putting their tooth under the pillow. You know, when the quarter or the dollar or $5 or $20, whatever it is today with inflation, they put it under there. There's money in the morning. I believe in the in the tooth fairy. So if the expectation is fulfilled, real often it's easy to believe. But, a tooth comes out and you're a little older and you don't tell mom and daddy that the tooth came out, and you stick it under your pillow, and the next morning that tooth is still there and there's no dollar. Then all of a sudden you begin to question. Well, anyway, when the promise is not fulfilled and the promise is delayed, and all outward appearances indicate that the promise is false because it remains unfulfilled, it causes doubt and causes faith to be shaken somewhat. But the delay in fulfillment of promise magnifies the importance of the aspect of hope as a part of our faith. That hope is such an important part of our faith. And so this comes out in this question and answer and struggle about, you promised me a child, but we're still childless. What's going on here? Therefore, we see that, and the fact that he's able to hold on to the faith and to trust when all evidence seems to go contrary. And that is a strong faith, a deep faith, a courageous faith, and so forth, that we are expected to strive to develop and hold on to. Then we have the fear, when God says, fear not. What is the fear here? And Brueggemann says the fear is for a future without children or heirs. What will become of me in my old age? Who will take care of my burial rites? If I die before the promise gets fulfilled, what's going to happen to me? So Brueggemann highlights the word reward in this account. And again, reward is oriented toward the future. Reward is something for which we might hope, it has to be hope. And again, it is held out as a possible promise for the future. But one of the things about reward is it's not something earned like wages, something due you, but it's really a gracious gift. Like a soldier doing his duty, fights bravely, performs above and beyond the call of duty, but there's nothing in the contract that says he's going to earn a reward. He's just doing his duty. That's what being a soldier means. But a king or a commanding officer might give him the gift of a reward of honor and a medal. But it's not guaranteed. But it's a reward. So in this word here, Brueggemann's kind of talking that the reward needs to be thought of kind of like that. But this promise of a reward will be like a gracious gift that he can't fully earn with deeds, but he can have faith and trust that God will be faithful to him, and he adjusts his life and expectations in line with that promise, holding on to the hope. And it affects his relationship with the promise giver. It puts him in a favorable relationship, a right relationship, and it will affect his future actions and behaviors. There are so many times in life that we sometimes receive honors or rewards or promotions, recommendations, appointments, and so forth, because it's not guaranteed. But if we're faithful and position ourselves in by being at our station, performing our duties, doing them well, then occasionally and sometimes then reward comes, recognition comes, but it's never guaranteed. We know, and disappointingly, lots of times, after all the hard work, after all the loyalty, after all of the service and duty, some pet or somebody else gets the reward or the position or the promotion who by merits doesn't deserve it. But that's the way life is. But it's a part of our integrity and faithfulness not to let that affect or deter us from doing our duty, being at our post, doing the best we can. The reward is not why we're doing it. The reward is icing on the cake, an extra gift. And if it doesn't come, we still got our salary, we still got our pay, we still were appreciated by others, we just didn't get the glory or the special extra thing. So anyway, Brueggemann does say that the way we position ourselves in regard to the hope and the promise does affect how we live and how we move on, but we may not get the kind of reward or glory that we might hope for. He points out and reflects on verse 6 that Abraham believed, and it wasn't explained to him, and he didn't figure it out how the promise would be fulfilled. He just believed. He trusted. And that trust and believing was reckoned as righteousness to him. And as I said, this is where biblical scholars and theologians cite this example of our own belief or doctrine that faith is a gift from God. It's not something that it's all on our part that we work on and make ourselves have faith. It comes to us. And some have that gift and can believe and trust, and there's some who can't or won't. But for those that do, we understand a part of it is a gift. We're not sure why. It can't be completely reasoned out and have a complete one-to-one cause and effect. So there is an element, and it's here in this that, he just up and believes. And he believes without having the proof given to him. It's that leap of faith or step of faith. But to be able to do that, there's an element of giftedness that's a part of our understanding of faith. So the act is part human, and our response is to accept this gift and to embrace the gift and the gift giver. But it does require a decision to believe, to trust. But it can't be proven to us with scientific tests. And again, there is an element of it's always in the future, so it can't be proven. It's not a done deal. There's an aspect of faith that some people want certitude before they'll believe. They have to have certitude. And the problem with that is once you have certitude, it's no longer faith. You know, I can give you a rock and I can say, this is a rock. Take it, hold it. Do you believe that's a rock? Yeah, I believe it's a rock. Well, there's no faith. You know, I've got certitude. I can feel it, I can touch it, I can crush it, I can put it in a lab. You know, I can recognize all the characteristics if I've had geology. Or you learn about rocks in architecture school. What kind of rocks don't crush under too much weight and so forth. You don't build a 30-story building on sandstone. You might build it on granite and concrete and steel. But anyway, the characteristics, there are ways to have certitude, but once you have certitude, there's no longer faith. Faith is oriented to a future and what is not yet known, but trusting that it will be. So, anyway, Brueggemann says 15:6 is one of the most important passages, and it's into our New Testament. Now, before we move on, any questions or comments about that aspect of where we've been? Yes, sir.
Chapter 15 is, used in the politics of the Middle East these days. Is that part of the argument?
It might be. I don't listen to the arguments carefully, so I haven't heard anybody picking it up, but you mean
I mean just as a foundation.
For who owns the land,
right.
You know, the Israelis and the Palestinians and so forth. Yes, I would say yes, that's this text and others are, this is, God has given us this land and promised it to us for perpetuity and so forth, and so it's not just geopolitical, but it's a strong religious, spiritual thing that gets all wrapped up in that question. So yes, but I haven't. Unfortunately, so much of the politics and what's going on isn't fully faith-based. It's all kinds of other issues.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
Just saying a foundation.
Yeah. This part of who owns the land, it's given to these people from God and promised to them. Now, we get through all of this, these promises and this faith and believing that God's going to make this miracle happen. And then we go right into chapter 16 that says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. Now we didn't need to know that. Again, we've been told that all along. But anyway, here it's repeated. And she had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. Abram said to Sarai, Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. And the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring on the way to Shur And the idea there is Hagar is leaving where they are and is trying to get back to Egypt. And he said to Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, "Where have you come from and where are you going?" She said, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He shall live at odds with all his kin." So she named the Lord who spoke to her. Now we got a difference between angel of the Lord and the Lord who spoke. This is a very early time, even before the development of angelic beings that are separate from God. It's kind of that circumlocution that's in the Bible. So often, instead of saying that God spoke and being so presumptuous as God spoke, or assuming that I'm so important that God's self came to me, but rather the Lord sent a messenger. It was through a messenger. But here it's a literary device, and there, at this early stage, there wasn't a development of a hierarchy of different angelic beings. So, and we hear it here. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived, bear a son, and for the Lord's given, and he shall," wild ass a man. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, "I have really seen God and remained alive after seeing him." Therefore, the well was called Bir El-Lahai-Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. We familiar with this story? Not usually preached on because it doesn't fit our Christian standards of monogamy and faithfulness to one's spouse and so forth. And it's kind of hard for us not to hear it with thinking that this is not right. You shouldn't be doing these sort of things. It sounds like really bad, unfaithful behavior on Abraham's part. And also it sounds like Sarah is not wanting to wait upon the Lord to fulfill the promise of a miracle baby. Abram seems to be breaking his faith and loyalty to his chosen wife, Sarai, in agreeing to have sex or make a baby with Hagar. However, this did give biblical scholars a lot of anxiety too in trying to interpret and deal with it. But since 1901, they had rediscovered the Code of Law of Hammurabi, and that had been long lost. This is an ancient law code that showed that in ancient Mesopotamian legislation had provided in great detail for these kind of cases, like Abram and Sarai being childless. And then a later law documentation from the Nuzi texts spelling out for the Akkadian culture just how to deal with the complicated emotional issues that arise when you try to come up with an heir this way. It's kind of in family law and domestic court, if you will. It was written that if the wife provided her husband with a slave girl for the purpose of childbearing, the husband was thereby precluded from taking a concubine on his own of his own choosing. And the purpose of the law had two objectives. First, to protect the wife's status as mistress of the household. And remember with earlier in this Akkadian law, we had Abram calling Sarai his sister. And this wife-sister role was to elevate the position of the wife in these upper-class societies, upper class of the culture. So if they were childless, this law did have that objective of protecting that wife's status, and then also to keep from dividing and diminishing the family inheritance, because if the husband had gotten a concubine pregnant, then that woman and her children would be different from the wife. And if he dies, then the inheritance would be split between them. But if she has the slave girl and the slave girl has the child, then those children are her property and under her control. And it's not just slave servants, but she would adopt this child. Just use the slave girl as a surrogate womb or a borrowed womb to give her a baby, and then the baby would be her child, and then all the inheritance would come to the first wife and that child or children. But anyway, that's kind of the reason that law was written and the way it was spelled out there. Now Sarai's words, "Perhaps I will have sons through her," is evidence that that's what's going on here. It's an expression of the legal concept of the wife owning, controlling, adopting, taking charge of the slave girl's offspring. Now the laws also dealt with the emotional and relational dynamics. A slave girl who went from the slave quarters to the master's bedroom in the big house or in the big tent obviously was raised to a different lifestyle that felt like and implied an elevated class status. It appeared like and it felt like an equality with the wife. And as this text says, Sarah gave Hagar to him as wife, although there probably wasn't any marriage ceremony, but it was that status that was felt or believed. But anyway, it'd be natural for one to feel like saying, Hagar or a slave girl, "Hey, look at me now. I'm in the big house. Look at all, I'm living the life of luxury." And if the slave girl is able to achieve something that the favored first wife had not been able to achieve, that is, get pregnant, provide a child, then it would be easy for her to develop an air of superiority, of feeling extra special, especially after the intimacy and the attention from the master husband. And we don't know how often or how long it took for Abram and Hagar to conceive a child. But anyway, the law codes dealt with that relational and behavioral dynamics. It was a prerogative of the wife to return the slave girl to the company and task of the slave quarters if she began to make herself a rival to the wife for the husband's love and affection and companionship. And if the slave girl had not conceived a child but still was acting that way, if she remained childless, she could be sold. She could be gotten rid of, out of the house, away. But if she had a child, the law made that impossible. But they did have the different status. She could be punished, and she wasn't supposed to be cruelly abused, but with different cultures, what is abuse and what is punishment, what is acceptable and what is not. So, some cultures are much rougher and harsh and more violent, just as lots of homes are different that way. But Sarah's outrage and indignation and crying about the injustice done to her, in a way, she was actually citing the legal issues that she has been wronged because of the way Hagar has treated her. There's a legal precedent that says Hagar is not supposed to do that, and she has the authority to discipline her in the Akkadian law and society. Well, as we read the story, it kind of sounds like Abram is kind of spineless. He just kind of, whatever you want, dear, just kind of goes along with whatever's happening and whatever she wants. And, first go in and have sex with this girl and make a baby. And he says, okay, I'll be happy to do that. And then he says, she's treating me bad. And then he said, well, okay, she's your slave. You deal with her. I'm out of this. I'm not getting involved in that. But actually, he is really following, in Vauder's commentary, he says he's just doing what custom told him to do. That was the way it was spelled out of how this is supposed to work. And when it gets sticky in the dynamics of the relationship, it's not his deal. It's between the mistress and the slave girl. However, I find it real interesting from a counseling point of view and family dynamic view. Abram was actually doing the proper thing. Yes, he was. He was doing the proper thing because, from one perspective, because the problem is the relationship and the problem was between Sarah and Hagar. Abram was refusing to be triangled into their fight. In family relationships, triangles are usually counterproductive. They are a temporary fix, but usually they make the underlying problem and the underlying relationships grow worse. For example, many of you have experienced this. Yourself as a child, or as a parent, or by observation. Two children are fighting over something, and usually the younger one whines and cries for mom or dad to intervene on his or her behalf against the older sibling. And if the parent sides with the younger, and the younger then wins the struggle, then the older child becomes resentful and may look for a way to get revenge when the parents aren't around. Probably. So he didn't have any dealing with them in any other relationship with them, is what you're saying. She would have female slaves, he would have male slaves. Probably. But actually, in that culture, it would probably be, if anybody really had ownership, Abram owned everything, but he, in the culture, probably delegated the wife to take care of the household and the household duties. He didn't want to mess with it, and that meant she would supervise the slave girls. But then, also, another thing, I'll deal with that question now. Hagar, why did Sarah pick Hagar? If they had such a huge household, could have these 318 men to go off and fight with those 4 against 5 kingdoms, then there's probably more than one slave girl. So why'd she pick Hagar, and where'd Hagar come from? Well, we think that Hagar came from the interlude down in Egypt, and when wife-sister thing, she ended up in Pharaoh's court, and harem, then there were probably lots of slave girls, servants in there. And then when Pharaoh gave him all this wealth to go away, she probably, take what you want. He said, what? She's really a nice servant. I'll take her. And so that was one thing. And then another, these are herder folks. They understand that the female and the male, have characteristics. And if you want healthy offspring, you want to get the strongest and the healthiest male and female for breeding stock. And so she's looking at her servants, who's the best breeding stock, because I want a really healthy, strong child. I don't want a sickly child who might not survive. And I want someone who, if he's going to be heir of this tribe, needs to be a good leader. Want him to be bright, intelligent, handsome, strong, capable. So you look at, what young woman here would probably produce a strong, healthy child, an attractive child. Hagar! And so I give you her. Well, for Hagar to be in the Pharaoh's harem, she was probably cream of the crop as well from their culture. So she probably had a lot of self-confidence and pride as far as slave girls go. And so it creates a situation there. But anyway, back to the siblings fighting and the triangling. If the parent sides with the younger and the younger wins, then the older child could be resentful and may want to get even. But then it does damage to the relationship with the parent and the older child, because then the child feels unfairly dealt with, that the parent didn't really listen to my side. So it does damage there. But I do realize sometimes the older children are stronger and they bully the younger child into submission, and so the child learns to get power support from parent to help them in these situations. But then it doesn't take long for a younger child to know, if I just start whining and crying, Mommy and Daddy are going to come and rescue me. And so they're just sitting in a room, and an older child just looks at them and starts whining. And anyway, so you get a dynamic where the two are not learning to work out their own differences. Yeah, that was a triangle there too, and we see the results. He was upset, and he gets even when he thinks the heavenly parent isn't watching. So the triangling can happen. The other part of triangling is if the one who intervenes comes up with the answer to the problem, then if it doesn't work, it's neither one of those two's responsibility to make it work or to take responsibility for it. They can blame the one who intervened. Well, your way didn't work. Well, they hadn't bought into the solution. So it's best to let the two people who are having the conflict work it out. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't help them in some ways, but be careful not to take ownership of the problem and come up with a solution and force it upon the folks who are having the problem. Anyway, it's best not to get triangled. So he's using a good technique not to get triangled in this and let them work it out. However, Sarah has too much power and ends up bullying Hagar. Now, there's another level in human relationships that we could suspect was the real problem, is Sarah's feelings about her relationship with Abram. She doesn't go yell at Hagar. She comes and yells at Abram. And it is Abram who she lashes out against first and who she complains to first. And it's safer to accuse Hagar of misbehaving than to ask him to define his true feelings for her and ask him to choose between the two. She didn't ask for that choice. She said, we'll let God choose between me and you who's doing right. Who's to blame for this problem? We'll let God choose between me and you, which assumes Abram has been doing something to encourage Hagar to behave the way she's behaving. He's spending too much time with her, giving her too much attention, or showing her special kindness or interest, and possibly ignoring and spending less time with Sarai. And so she's rightfully feeling threatened and is upset and gets angry at him. But then, and you're right, it was probably not the best thing to give her in charge, but he should have done something rather than, you two work it out. He should have listened to her feelings, not the issue of justice and what's not, but listen to her feelings. And why is she upset? Why is she hurt? And let her get that out, and then reassure her that she still is number one in his heart, and that he will adjust his time and not have this relationship with Hagar. Now that she's pregnant, he doesn't have to be related to her in that intimate way anymore. So, anyway, those are some interesting things. There's a whole lot more dynamics in this story that we can pick up on next week, and you all can read and think about it yourself and come back with all kinds of opinions and ideas and questions about what should have really happened there or what shouldn't have happened there, and what's the best way to resolve this problem from your vast experience of human relationships. Let us pray. Dear God, we know that the people of the Bible and in the Bible were human beings. They were like us, with feelings that get hurt, with strong passions and loves and hopes for the future. And they discovered you in the midst of their lives and tried to respond to your claim upon them and call of them to be your servants and instruments in developing and leading a people that would carry your truth throughout the generations. So help us learn from them and their experiences who you are and how we are meant to be. In Christ's name, amen. Reserved.
I like your tie.
Oh, thanks.